Jeffrey Anderson. Jeff spent 15 years as the McCormick Museum's interpretations manager before taking on the role of exhibition coordinator and assistant curator for the First Division Museum at Cantini Park. A lead researcher on museum exhibits and public programs, Jeff holds a master's in U.S. history from Roosevelt University and is an adjunct history professor at the College of DuPage. Please, everyone, help me welcome Jeff Anderson.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. How's the volume? Can you hear me? Awesome. So this is a really awesome year for the Chicago Tribune. It's been 175 years of Chicago Tribune history. Put it in perspective, it's 175 years of informing people of news. And they covered a lot of news in 175 years. There's no way I could cover that all tonight. So I decided I was going to do a different route. When newspapers are supposed to inform people of historical events or just events going on, sometimes newspapers kind of go off the rails a little bit and they actually create news. And the Chicago Tribune has done quite a bit of that. So I was really hoping to spend my time talking about the Chicago Tribune, kind of the evolution of the newspaper, who was running it, and really focusing on some of these really big events the Chicago Tribune was connected to. So we're going to start with the Chicago Tribune and its founding.
One moment, your mic isn't on for our Zoom audience.
I will wait before I start my clicking. Do you want me to keep talking?
Keep talking.
Okay, I can do that. So, one thing that gets me really excited when I do these talks, I don't know if, I think a few of you have been to a couple of my other talks, is when I get to learn something new, I get all excited. And I think I'm going in and out. And I got really excited because I learned some things I never knew about the Chicago Tribune, and connected to one of my favorite historical figures, Joseph Medill. So I'm going to be kind of branching out a little bit when I get to the Medill years, just because that's kind of my big interest in history. But we'll definitely be focusing on 1847 to right around 1955, which is really the focus of the Medill, McCormick, Patterson era, basically 100 years of them running that newspaper.
Cool. I know we're good. Can you set up with the mic on that thing?
I think we're switching mics.
We're switching mics.
Okay, I can do that. How about now? Not even on, I don't think. How about now? Am I coming through? Okay, awesome. So, are we good on virtual?
Yes, you're good.
Sweet. So now I'm going to get started with my talk. So again, we're going to be seeing a lot of headlines. If you really want to go home and read more about any of these headlines, you can more than welcome to do so. Almost every headline that I'm going to be bringing you today, you can access via newspapers.com, where they have several different newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune. So the very first Chicago Tribune that newspapers.com has is this one. Now, it is from 1849, and it's the first Tribune that they have. It's a little out of date because Tribune's actually 2 years older than that. It was founded in 1847. It was founded by these three individuals. We have James Kelly, John Wheeler, and Joseph Forrest. So that's who started the paper in 1847. When the paper was started, as most things do when it started, it was quite small. It didn't have a big circulation. I know for a while there, they were running at a couple hundred newspapers a day as far as its circulation would go. And the Chicago Tribune between 1847 and 1855 will go through several different owners, or as they called themselves, proprietors and editors and publishers of the Chicago Tribune between 1847 and 1855. And the reason that changes so much in 1855 is because one of my favorite figures, a gentleman named Joseph Medill, decided to come to Chicago in about March of 1855 from Cleveland, Ohio, where he had become a newspaper publisher of one of the largest newspapers in Ohio called the Cleveland Leader. So in 1855, I chose this headline because this is the first time that the Chicago Tribune actually acknowledges that it's under new management. And to blow it up a little bit, this is talking about how Joseph Medill and company, that company would be a couple people who joined the Chicago Tribune with him, and the big person that really is a part of this is the gentleman off to the side, and that gentleman's name is Dr. Charles Ray. The reason this combination worked so well together is because both of them had been publishers previously. Joseph Medill was an anti-slavery Whig from Ohio who would become a founding member of the Republican Party, and Dr. Charles Ray was an anti-slavery Democrat from Galena, Illinois, and he ran the Galena Jeffersonian. Dr. Ray wrote these really fiery editorials, so that was really what he was good at. And Joseph Medill was really good at organizing, running circulation, and advertisements. So combine those two together, and you get a really well-run paper. They decided that they would, instead of creating a new newspaper, buy into a newspaper that wasn't doing so well, and they chose to buy in. Together, they bought controlling interest in the Chicago Tribune. So this is what I call kind of the beginning of the Medill era. So the Chicago Tribune does really well under their leadership. By 1858, it's actually tripled its circulation. So at this point, it's running into the thousands. It's roughly around 3,000 circulation daily, and more than that on the weekends. But in 1858, the Chicago Tribune decided to consolidate with another newspaper in Chicago, and they merge, and they take the two newspapers, come together, and they rename the paper from the Chicago Tribune, and the other newspaper was called the Chicago Democratic Press, and they merged together and created the Chicago Press and Tribune. So this is the first paper that is actually under this new name. And here it's blown up because we have three major figures coming from the Chicago Democratic Press and three people coming from the Chicago Tribune, and they really become the driving force of a really interesting time in Tribune history. The three that come from the Chicago Democratic Press is John Locke Scripps, who actually had worked at the Chicago Tribune in the late 1940s, early 1950s, before he decided to leave and join a business partner, William Bross, who would also eventually become lieutenant governor of Illinois, and they established the Chicago Democratic Press with their partner, B.W. Spears. So that's the other newspaper. And then you have the Chicago Tribune, which brings in Dr. Charles Ray, Joseph Medill, and this other gentleman, and you'll see his name a few times. His name's Alfred Coles. Alfred Coles was actually one of Joseph Medill's business partners in Ohio when they owned pieces of the Cleveland Leader together. And he came to Chicago at Medill's request, bought into the Tribune. So these would be the six men who from 1858 for a little while would be the driving force at the Chicago Tribune. Now we get to a really interesting period in Tribune history because 1858 is when Abraham Lincoln starts becoming a prominent figure. And he becomes a pretty prominent figure because of the Chicago Tribune, which became his big mouthpiece during his senatorial race versus Stephen Douglas. So some of the interesting ways the Chicago Tribune promoted Lincoln. Any newspaper can write a nice editorial about you, but when a newspaper really likes you, they go a little beyond that. So the Chicago Tribune starts promoting this image of Lincoln, and you can see Lincoln here, and he's sitting down with a newspaper, and you can see it says Press and Tribune. And this is the image that they're circulating. So the Chicago Tribune on July 17th publishes an article that's really quite amusing. There's another Chicago newspaper, the Journal, who's basically taking a crack at the Chicago Tribune, that they're trying to promote their own newspaper by having Lincoln sitting with it and taking a picture of it. And the Chicago Tribune responds with, it'd be a real curiosity to find any photograph of Abraham Lincoln holding the Journal. So this is them taking another crack at another newspaper in Chicago. So the reason I chose this is the fact that this photograph's a fake. This is the original photograph. This photograph was taken in 1854, and he's not holding a copy of the Chicago Tribune. He's actually holding a copy of a German newspaper. I don't know how in the 1850s you can do Photoshop, but that's exactly what happened here, is they changed the newspaper because if they're going to promote Lincoln as this big candidate, they want to also promote their own newspaper. So this is this really neat way of promoting both Lincoln and themselves. I will highlight that Abraham Lincoln was a subscriber to the Chicago Tribune starting in 1855, so it wasn't that much of a shift. Another way that the Chicago Tribune, after Lincoln's senatorial loss versus Stephen Douglas, the Tribune continues to back Lincoln and editorials in other ways. But to give you another idea of how they can kind of help behind the scenes is you can see this letter that's at the Library of Congress. The letter is written by John Locke Scripps. That's that editor, proprietor of the Tribune. And he's writing to Abraham Lincoln to inform him that the biography that he's writing on Lincoln, which he's been working with Lincoln to create, is nearly complete. And in the transcription, you can read that he writes that Medill is on his way to New York to finalize the details to publish this biography. This biography that Scripps wrote and Medill is having published is the first published biography of Abraham Lincoln ever written. And I bring it up because I'm really excited this year. We got a copy of it. So we actually have one of these biographies in our collection now. So this is this really cool first ever biography of Abraham Lincoln. It's called The Life of Abraham Lincoln and Tribune Tracts. So this is one of the ways the Tribune was promoting Lincoln kind of beyond the editorial page. Now, of course, Lincoln would go on to win that presidential election, and the Chicago Tribune would go through a minor shift at this point in 1860, because after almost 2 years of calling themselves the Chicago Press and Tribune, they decided to cut the press out, and they go back to calling themselves the Chicago Tribune. They justified it saying that they did it so that all the people who read the Democratic press would know that the same people were at the newspaper. I just think it was saving them ink. But you can see here, this is from that same headline, and you can see they have 5 of those 6 same individuals are there. The only one that's gone is one of the owners of the Democratic press, but you still have the same major figures. You have William Bross, you have John Locke Scripps, Dr. Ray, Medill, and Alfred Coles. The reason that I'm pointing these out is because these are the gentlemen who really, through the Chicago Tribune, was backing and helping Lincoln elected. And in many ways, they were kind of rewarded for doing so, not by Lincoln himself, but by the circulation of the Chicago Tribune. By this point, the Chicago Tribune was had the highest circulation newspaper in Chicago. So as Lincoln became more popular, so did the newspaper. It also made these men fairly wealthy. Now, of course, shortly after Abraham Lincoln's elected president, we go to war. So this is the headline from the Chicago Tribune when Fort Sumter's attacked. And most historians, when they talk about the Chicago Tribune during the Civil War era, they kind of talk about the Tribune as being more of a warmonger newspaper. And if you read this headline, basically it says, war's inaugurated, and they're really pushing that they need to go into the South and they need to make them pay. And just to kind of justify that, the reason all of these gentlemen are working together is they're coming from different political parties, but they have one thing in common, is that they're all anti-slavery men. A couple of them are actually self-described abolitionists. So this is a big issue for them, and they feel that politics isn't going to get it done. The war might get this taken care of. So that's why they're so in favor of the war effort. So this is the attack on Fort Sumter. When the war broke out, the Chicago Tribune was encouraging people to sign up for the Union Army. And it wasn't just people in Chicago, which by percentage, Cook County had some of the largest percentage of able-bodied men that actually signed up for the Union. Including that was many members of the Chicago Tribune, including Joseph Medill's 3 younger brothers. One of his brothers became quite famous because when he signed up the day after the attack on Fort Sumter, he would become a member of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, which was a fairly well-known cavalry unit in the Union Army during the Civil War. They were at many of the major battles, and of course, since it's the Illinois Cavalry, there's a lot of readers in Chicago that want to know what's going on with them, what are they doing. Lucky for the Tribune, they basically have an embedded reporter with the 8th Illinois Cavalry, since Major William Medill would actually send back letters to the Chicago Tribune about what was going on during the war and with the cavalry unit. Unfortunately, Major Medill was also at the Battle of Gettysburg, and after Lee is defeated there, he's leading a scouting group that's pursuing some of the Confederate troops, and he's unfortunately mortally wounded. So he's one of the Tribune employees who was lost during the Civil War. Two of Joseph Medill's three younger brothers are lost during the Civil War. So that's this article talking about William Medill's passing. There's a bit of a shakeup at the Chicago Tribune in 1864. Dr. Ray, who had been writing a lot of the editorials for the Tribune, decides that working at the Tribune isn't profitable enough. So through his connection with Abraham Lincoln, Dr. Ray gets permission to go to the border states and Confederate territory to sell goods. And so he leaves and retires from the Chicago Tribune. Long story short, this doesn't work out well for Ray. He does not make the fortune he expects to, and he comes back to the Chicago Tribune. This is a problem for the Tribune because they've already reworked out the structure, and Joseph and a few of the other editors actually write to Lincoln saying, you need to get Ray out of here because it's jeopardizing the newspaper, it's jeopardizing your support. And Lincoln, through General Grant, actually gives Dr. Ray permission to go back to the border states and Confederate territory and sell whiskey. This, again, does not work out for Ray, and he eventually passes away shortly thereafterwards, but that's what this article is about. The next one. This is a little bit confusing. The Chicago Tribune was a huge supportive newspaper for Abraham Lincoln. And after the war is over and Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and slavery is abolished, Joseph Medill is kicked out of his position as publisher of the Chicago Tribune. And the reason for this is because he's not the majority owner. He's just an owner of the Chicago Tribune. And this article published by the Tribune is answering a question people are asking, is why is Joseph Medill's letters in other newspapers opposing the Chicago Tribune's viewpoint? And it explains because we basically kicked Joseph Medill out of his editorial chair, and what happened during this time is Joseph Medill was very in favor of tariffs, national tariffs, and all the other editors of the Chicago Tribune wanted to have free trade. And this issue separated them politically. So Joseph Medill, while he was still owner, was subjugated to basically being in charge of the circulation desk and advertising desk, and he wasn't in charge of it. He still had a vote, but he didn't get his opinions in the Tribune. It would be this way from 1865 until 1874. And the reason this all happened is because of this gentleman, Horace White. Horace White was a Tribune reporter who would actually travel around with Lincoln and report back to the Chicago Tribune about his talks and things of that nature. He would continue to work at the Tribune until he bought out Dr. Ray's shares, and under Horace White, the Chicago Tribune shifts its political stance. The newspaper goes from being this anti-slavery Republican newspaper to it becomes what's called a liberal Republican newspaper, and this is an era where there's a rift between the Republican Party. And Joseph Medill, who is big friends with Ulysses S. Grant, has a lot of different opinions than the other editors of the Tribune. So this is kind of why Joseph Medill loses his position at the Chicago Tribune for a number of years. And when he loses his position, he's looking for other things to do. So he starts getting involved in a lot of political issues at the time, up until 1871. In 1871, something big happens in Chicago. It basically burns down. The Great Chicago Fire happens. And when the Great Chicago Fire goes through Chicago, the Tribune isn't spared. They're in a brand new fireproof building, and since Joseph Medill isn't running it, they don't buy fire insurance, and of course the building burns down. And all of the other editors who were supposed to be running the Tribune weren't there. Joseph Medill, however, is there because his house is not in the path of the fire. All of the other owners of the Tribune have houses on Michigan Avenue, so their houses are all burnt. So they're dealing with their homes and their families, while Joseph lives a little further away out of the fire zone, and he stays at the Chicago Tribune throughout the whole fire. When he realizes that the building is lost, he decides that he's going to get all the employees out, whatever equipment he can out, and then he leaves the Tribune, rents another location, and starts buying printing equipment. And while everybody else is running around, Joseph Medill is putting the Chicago Tribune back together again. And the day after the fire, this is his hard work done. This is the only newspaper available in the city of Chicago after the fire, with a fairly famous headline. So famous that they actually made my shirt because of it. So this is the Cheer Up headline. Cheer up, Chicago shall rise again. Now, you have to imagine, put yourself in these people's footsteps. A lot of houses burnt down. A lot of people are homeless, and people are looking at what the Chicago Tribune was able to do. The building burnt down. How did they get a newspaper out? And it was because of Joseph Medill, who's credited with coming up with this headline. This caught the attention of a lot of the powerful people in Chicago, and they decided to ask Joseph Medill if he wanted to run for mayor. And he told them absolutely not. He had no interest in running for mayor. But after a series of negotiations back and forth, he agrees that he would run for mayor, and you'd think he'd run as a Republican, but he does not. He decides he's going to run under a new political ticket called the fireproof ticket. So the Chicago Tribune, who's not real happy with Medill at this point, still doesn't give him a lot of political support, but they can't ignore the election. And Joseph Medill wins in a landslide. So Joseph Medill is elected on the fireproof ticket. Now you'd think he'd be running against a Democrat. It was not the case. He actually ran against his Republican opponent, and he won in a landslide. So Medill, most of his tickets elected, and Joseph Medill becomes Chicago's rebuilding mayor. And he would spend the majority of his next few years helping rebuild the city of Chicago, up until the last couple months of his mayoral term, and he decided he didn't want to be mayor anymore. So he just picked up his family and left, appointed somebody else to finish off his term, and he went to Europe. So this is Joseph Medill in his term as mayor. But what most people don't know is he left and went to Europe, but he was still in contact with the Chicago Tribune through telegraphs. So he started sending all of these telegraphs back explaining that he was done. The Chicago Tribune, other proprietors could either purchase his shares out, or they could sell him their shares. He's like, I'm done with this. Buy my shares out. I'll buy another newspaper, and I'll basically make it a Republican newspaper again, and I'm going to put you out of business. They finally agree. So Joseph actually takes a boat and comes all the way back to Chicago, leaves his family in Europe, and when he arrives in Chicago, they inform him that they changed their minds. And they aren't going to sell him, they aren't going to buy his shares out, but they do counteroffer to sell him their shares at a much higher price. Joseph Medill says, sure. Goes to one of his friends, a gentleman named Marshall Field, borrows $250,000, and buys controlling interest in the Chicago Tribune. Now, of course, the Tribune owners and editors at this time are not going to talk about how they're thinking about selling or buying somebody else's shares. But what this newspaper does, and several other newspapers, when they find out that Medill bought the Tribune out, this is the Iowa State Register, and they let everybody know that Medill is now in charge of the Tribune again. He bought out Horace White, and Horace White would go on in New York and have a long career there, but that the Chicago Tribune is now under new management again. What Joseph does goes a little step further. He takes over the Tribune, and everybody who subscribes to it gets this. He basically writes them a nice little insert. He basically says, the newspaper's mine again, and I'm going to take it back to my Republican principles, and it'll stay this way until my passing. So he basically informs everybody who runs the Tribune that you're going to be getting my opinions now. And this is quite important because at this time, a lot of people are buying newspapers because of the opinion of the publisher. And he was one of the people that helped Lincoln, so this is something that a lot of Chicagoans know about, and it brings a lot of readers back to the Chicago Tribune. Okay, so this headline, by 1886, Joseph Medill had two daughters. One of his daughters decided to marry somebody that made Joseph very unhappy, the nephew of Cyrus McCormick. The reason it made him unhappy is because Cyrus McCormick was from a slave-owning Democratic family, so it made him upset. But all of a sudden, now his family is connected through marriage to the McCormick Reaper family. So this is a headline published in the Chicago Tribune about a strike that had just happened at the McCormick Reaper Works. And at this strike, they brought in strike breakers who not only assaulted the striking employees, but a couple of them were killed. Because of this attack on the McCormick Reaper worker employees, a lot of Chicago laborers get together and say, let's have a meeting in the Haymarket. And they decide to meet there the next day, and it became one of Chicago's biggest historical events, the Haymarket riot. So the next day, you have the headline from the Haymarket. But the reason these people were coming together was because of what had happened to, I guess, this family, because they were connected to the Reaper family at this point. So this is those two headlines, and it does connect right back to the McCormick family. So this is quite interesting. I know I did this for Chris. He really loved this part of it. During the 1880s, the Chicago Tribune started reporting on these really strange murders that are occurring in another country. So this is the article where they first refer to these strange murders that happened in Whitechapel in England. Over the next few months, there would be several more articles about this, and lots of names were given to this murderer, and it's what we remember today as Jack the Ripper. But the reason I bring this up is because during this really important time in Chicago, Joseph Medill is still the owner and publisher of the Tribune, but he's not running it anymore. Joseph Medill's other daughter decided that she was going to marry another prominent Chicagoan, and that would be this gentleman, Robert Patterson Jr. Robert Patterson Jr.'s father is Robert Patterson Sr., and he's quite powerful individual in Chicago. He was a minister at the Second Presbyterian Church in Chicago. He was a founding member of Lake Forest College, and then his son would eventually work at a few newspapers before going on to the Chicago Tribune, where he met one of Joseph Medill's daughters, Eleanor. Eventually marries Eleanor, and then from the 1880s up until about 1910, he would be the driving force at the Chicago Tribune. The reason I bring this up is because a lot of journalistic historians refer to him as being one of the best newspaper publishers of this entire era. He definitely brought the circulation of the Chicago Tribune up quite a bit, and he's the driving force at the Tribune during this period. One of Chicago's biggest events ever, and one of the most beautiful newspapers I've ever seen, is this newspaper from the opening day of the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. I love the fact you can see the Great White City in the background of the newspaper. The reason this is so important to the Tribune is because the Tribune actually helped get the World's Fair to Chicago. If anybody has ever read Devil in the White City, at the very beginning of it, the people of Chicago were actually going to the Tribune to find out, did we get the fair? And the reason they're doing that is because the Tribune has a direct wire all the way to DC. And that's why they were going to find that out, because the Tribune was really pushing to get the fair to Chicago. They thought it was a great opportunity to highlight how far Chicago had come after the fire, and Joseph Medill helped that happen. And because of that, Joseph Medill was made a board member and director of the Columbian Exposition. He also used his political power to get his son-in-law appointed to a really interesting position. So this gentleman is Robert Sanderson McCormick. Robert Sanderson McCormick was appointed by Congress to be the congressional ambassador of the Columbian Exposition. Basically what his job was to go around to other countries, Europe and other places, and talk those countries into either investing or participating, or better yet, both at the 1893 World's Fair. So this is what Robert's father was doing this period of time. So the Tribune is very invested in the fair. Now, the last thing a big publisher does for a newspaper is he passes away. And this is the headline from when Joseph Medill passes away. So when Joseph Medill passes away, the Chicago Tribune is considered not just a big Chicago paper. It's one of the bigger newspapers in the Midwest. It's making a lot of money. To give an idea how much money we're talking about, 2 years before, in 1897, Joseph Medill was offered nearly $7 million. That's not by today's standards, that's 1897 standards, for his shares of the Chicago Tribune, and he owned 55% of that paper. To give you an idea how powerful and much money was at this paper. Joseph Medill's two daughters tell him not to sell it because they were hoping that their children, Joseph's grandchildren, would eventually be able to take over the paper and run it. So Joseph decides he would not. So upon his passing, Joseph Medill decides that he's going to create what's called the Medill Tribune Trust. And basically he takes his shares of the Chicago Tribune, puts it in a family trust so that both daughters and their families will then handle his trust for him. And this guarantees an opportunity for his grandchildren to eventually follow in his footsteps. It also keeps the Chicago Tribune in the family's control up until 1955. So early 1900, we have an assassination attempt, which actually turns out to be an assassination because he passes it of William McKinley. The reason I bring this up is because McKinley was very close friends with the Medill family, because President McKinley, one of his biggest supporters was a gentleman named Senator Mark Hanna, and that's this gentleman. Senator Mark Hanna was what we call a kingmaker. He's one of those really powerful, connected individuals, and he really helped McKinley become president. Mark Hanna, who was a senator, had a daughter, and at a very young age, they thought, what a great combination if my daughter, Mark Hanna's daughter, were to marry into the Medill Tribune family. And they decided that Joseph Medill's oldest grandson would be betrothed at a young age to Ruth Hanna. And this is Ruth Hanna in D.C. with her friend Alice Roosevelt. Now, this actually works out. Many years later, they do get wed. There is a very powerful political connection there. Her husband, his name's Joseph Medill McCormick, would go on to become a congressman and senator from Illinois. And then after his passing, Ruth Hanna would help break through a whole bunch of barriers by becoming the 17th woman in the United States to be elected to Congress, the second from Illinois, and the first woman in the United States to be elected, nominated by a major political party to run for Senate. So she's a really powerful figure as well. So this is that connection. So mid-1900s, Robert McCormick doesn't think he's going to get an opportunity to run the Tribune. So after he graduates from Yale, he comes back to Chicago to take law classes. And when he comes back to Chicago, the city fathers are like, hey, we like the McCormick family. So they ask Robert if he would run for alderman in Chicago, and he agrees to do so. And of course, his family's newspaper endorses him. So this is Robert's endorsement for alderman in 1904. He does such a good job that the same powerful Chicagoans ask him if he'd run as president of the sanitary district. And of course, he's like, sure, I'll do it. And of course, the Tribune endorses him again. And he wins that election, and he would go on to do that for several years. But right at the end of his term as being president of the sanitary district, he gets an opportunity to get involved in the Chicago Tribune. And this is actually from a board meeting of the directors of the Chicago Tribune, where you might recognize some of these names from the talk so far. So we have, as directors, we have Robert Patterson. Again, that is Joseph Medill's son-in-law. We have Alfred Coles. Medill McCormick is Joseph Medill McCormick, Joseph's oldest grandson. So these are all individuals that are directors. But at the very bottom, you'll see under secretary and treasurer, two names that finally occur here. This is Joseph Medill's other grandchildren, Joseph Medill Patterson and Robert McCormick take on those roles. It's their first opportunity to work at the Chicago Tribune, and they would eventually go on to become the driving force at the newspaper. And it's good that it happened at this point, because the following year, the person holding the newspaper together, Robert Patterson, dies. So this is the headline from Robert Patterson passing away. Now, the day that Robert Patterson passes away, he's not in Chicago, but his mother is. And unfortunately, when his mother passes away, Robert Patterson takes his own life. So this leaves a huge vacuum at the Chicago Tribune. And the family, again, considers selling the newspaper. But they make the decision to not sell it because Joseph Patterson and Robert McCormick decide to join forces and co-publish the Chicago Tribune. So this allows the newspaper to stay in the family. To give you an idea of some of these individuals, so this is a quick photograph. You got Joseph Medill sitting in the middle, Robert McCormick's in the white slacks. He would become the driving force at the Chicago Tribune. Above him is his cousin, Sissy Patterson, who would become a major figure in publishing as well. She worked at the Tribune on and off, but then she finally decided that she had enough of Tribune, and she actually went to work for their big rival, William Randolph Hearst. Impressed Hearst so much that she managed to buy a couple papers from Hearst, combine them together, and she created the Washington Times-Herald, and she became the first female to become a publisher of a major metropolitan newspaper in the United States. The other gentleman standing up, that is Robert's older brother, that is Joseph Medill McCormick, who became a congressman and senator. And then the other gentleman in the black slacks sitting down, that's Joseph Medill Patterson. There's lots of Joseph Medills. And he would go on to co-run the Tribune, but then he really made a name for himself by making the New York Daily News. So this is Joseph Medill's grandchildren I've been talking about. 1915. The United States is not involved in the war at this point, but the Chicago Tribune is, because they have a number of war correspondents that they're sending all over the place in Europe to report back on what's going on. And of course, one of the co-publishers is one of these individuals. So this is Robert when he was a war correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. He's going to the Russian front, and when he's out there, he's writing articles. This is his first article that was published in the Chicago Tribune on his experiences there. But when he went, he also grabbed the Chicago Tribune photographer, and he brought a brand new piece of equipment called a video camera. And they start taking footage. And that footage, the photographs and the stories are all being sent back to the Chicago Tribune for Tribune readers to read, see, and go to the theaters and watch. So this is what Robert McCormick's doing during the 1915. When the United States does get involved in the war, the Chicago Tribune, you could say, is very in favor of the war effort. This is an insert from the Chicago Tribune, and you can see it's 157 of Tribune employees. These are all Tribune employees who are serving in different branches of the military during the war. And the two publishers and editors are also serving. So you have Robert McCormick and Joe Patterson, who are both serving overseas as well. So very in favor of the war effort. Now, if you've been to Cantini before, you might recognize the name of this next headline, because this is the first time the Chicago Tribune mentions this small village called Cantini, because this is when they finally get word of a battle that happened on the 28th called the Battle of Cantini. And of course, our benefactor, Colonel Robert R. McCormick, is there, so the Tribune has a big interest in this. So this is it blown up. They don't have a lot of information, so they're basically just mentioning that there's this offensive victory against the Germans, and then there's a small village, Cantini, so it lists that. But of course, if you're a newspaper, you get more information, and the next day you get this headline, which is 2 days after the Battle of Cantini. So it blown up. You can see it goes more in depth with details. Now it's not just the offensive victory, it's talking about the many German counterattacks that are fended off. So this is when the Chicago Tribune is first talking about the historic battle that we're named after. After the war is over, the Chicago Tribune probably gets its biggest scoop in Tribune history. So during the negotiations that would eventually lead to the Treaty of Versailles, not everybody who was at the negotiating table was happy with what was going on. Really, it was being dominated by 3 different countries, and everybody else was being ignored. And when you're ignored, you get upset. When you get upset, you steal an early copy of the treaty, and you run off and you hand it to a Chicago Tribune reporter, which is exactly what happens. So the Chicago Tribune gets an early copy of the Treaty of Versailles, smuggles it back to the United States, and then what do you do with it? First off, you tell everybody you have it, and then to make a big headline, you walk into Congress and you hand Congress an unsigned copy of the Treaty of Versailles. And that's exactly what the Chicago Tribune does. So this is, again, it might have been an early version, but it's almost exactly what eventually is signed. So the Tribune has the treaty. It's a huge scoop for the Chicago Tribune. Oh, there's a big blown up version of it. And it's talking about the reporter that brought it back and all the information about it. So this is one of the biggest scoops in Tribune history. During the war, the Chicago Tribune, I think I mentioned, was very pro-war effort. Not every newspaper, or not every business in the United States was not very pro-war effort. Some of them were very opposed to the war effort, getting involved, all of that. One of those individuals was Henry Ford. Henry Ford made it very clear that if any of his employees decided to leave working for him and join the war effort, he would not save their jobs. This upset McCormick and others at the Tribune, so they, of course, call him an anarchist. When they called him an anarchist, Henry Ford got really angry, and he decided to sue the Chicago Tribune for libel for $1 million. They delay the trial because there's a war going on, but after the war's over, they hold the trial. It's called the trial of the century. I know there's a whole bunch of trials of the century, but this is one of them, and it's this big legal case. And you can see Henry Ford wins, and they award him 6 cents of the $1 million he's seeking. So he can call it a victory if he wants to, but Robert never paid him. He said, I'll never pay him the 6 cents. So it actually turns into a big publicity stunt for the Chicago Tribune that they end up going as on the trial. This is the first copy of a brand new newspaper in 1919. After returning from the war, Colonel McCormick's cousin, Joe Patterson, Captain Patterson, decides that he really likes the European tabloid format, and he wants to see if it'll work. But he doesn't think it'll work in Chicago. So he grabs a bunch of Tribune money, goes all the way to New York, and he establishes what we think of as the New York Daily News. This is the first edition of the New York Illustrated Daily News. This would go on to be a huge success. It would become at one point the most circulated newspaper in the world. So it very quickly made him a very prominent figure in his own right. And he's doing this all with Tribune funds. So Robert and his cousin decided they're going to split off. Robert is going to become the publisher of Tribune and stay in Chicago. And Joe Patterson is going to stay in New York and become publisher of the Daily News. But each of them would co-publish the other's newspapers and keep offices at the other paper. So this is something that would last through the rest of their lives together. So at this point, they have 2 of the bigger newspapers in the United States. I don't know if anybody's a Cub fan, but the Tribune was. This is the first time the Chicago Tribune runs an article talking about the brand new radio station that they have and how they used it to broadcast part of a Chicago Cubs game. So this is 1924. So this is how long they've been broadcasting the Cubs up until recently on WGN. And WGN radio, of course, stands for World's Greatest Newspapers, what they call themselves. So that's this headline from the Tribune. And then the next one is something that would become very important to the Tribune, because while Robert McCormick was very opposed to prohibition, he didn't get to say if people could drink or not. That was dealt with other individuals, but what he also did not like was people being murdered in the streets. So this is the headline from what was now known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The fact that organized crime in Chicago had become so blatant that they would do this in the street was bad business. Literally, it was making people who like money lose money. So a number of these very powerful Chicago businessmen got together and decided that they were going to run organized crime out of Chicago. So these 6 wealthy Chicagoans come together and they organize a group called the Chicago Secret Six. And basically they fund all of the prosecution that occurs bringing Al Capone to trial in a couple of years. And the reason I bring this up is because there's no evidence that Robert McCormick was ever a member of the Secret Six, but he's widely acknowledged as the mouthpiece of the Chicago Secret Six. They used the Chicago Tribune to put their opinions out there, and what they were working to bring out organized crime was all done through the Chicago Tribune. And this wasn't a surprise to Al Capone, because it's a documented meeting where he actually went to the Tribune and tried to convince them to lay off, and Robert said no. So this is St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The next year, Robert gets really incensed with one of his Tribune employees is murdered or assassinated. His name was Jake Lingle, and he was a crime correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, and he is assassinated, and Robert offers a $30,000 bounty on information on his assassin. When they start to really dig into it, they find out that this man is living a very lavish lifestyle for somebody who's just a newspaper reporter. Turns out he was actually in league with the mob. He considered himself to be a bit of a mobster, and he was taking all of these loans out from various gangsters in Chicago who eventually he couldn't pay back. This is why he's assassinated. It has nothing to do with the fact that he worked at the Tribune. So this is kind of a big black eye for the Chicago Tribune at this point. But it doesn't stop them from prosecuting Al Capone. So eventually, Capone goes to prison. The reason they did all this was a little selfishly to clean up the streets so that they could make a profit. But a bigger issue is what happens 2 years later, which is the 1933 World's Fair. The 1933 World's Fair is another monumental moment in Chicago history, the century of progress. It's not a good time in America. They really wanted to bring some hope back to Chicago, some business in Chicago, and the Chicago Tribune played a major role. Not only was the Tribune endorsing bringing the fair, but they actually, Robert was a director of the fair, and he actually was in charge of the sports building. And Robert appointed his sports editor, Arch Ward, to create new events. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the All-Star Game, but the very first All-Star Game was put on by the Chicago Tribune, by Arch Ward, for the 1933's fair. He would go on to create other events such as the football All-Star Game, and all of these other things were done by Arch Ward, but this one specifically, the first baseball All-Star Game, was because of the 1933 World's Fair. Now we get to the 1940s. Pretty well it's dominated by World War II, and I could give you a lot of different headlines from the Chicago Tribune from that period, but this is probably the most infamous during this period. Now, a little backstory. During World War II, if you wanted to release any news, it had to go through various levels of war censorship, so I want to put that out there. A story gets sent back to the Chicago Tribune by one of the reporters who managed to hitch a ride on a Navy vessel, got some information, and sent it back to the Chicago Tribune. And that information went through 3 levels of censorship, and then, after being approved, was printed in Tribune-run newspapers. And this is why the Chicago Tribune was indicted by the Roosevelt administration, basically trying to bring Tribune up on treason charges, including the reporter, Colonel McCormick, and a number of other individuals. Because this story told the world that we broke the Japanese code during the middle of the war. Now, the Chicago Tribune didn't know we broke the code. The reporter basically just wrote down some information that had been decoded and sent it back to the Tribune. They went through the various censorship they needed to go through, and then they published it. The reason all this is known now is because a historian actually fought like a 20-year legal battle to have all of these documents released because they were under lock and key. But they finally got permission to see all of these files to basically show that, yes, they did unknowingly alert the world that we broke the Japanese code. So this is quite a big thing. It would lead to a federal grand jury that was brought together. Robert is brought up, and this is the article where they're basically saying, hey, there's not enough evidence for us to go through with any kind of a prosecution on these charges. So basically the Tribune is let off, Robert's let off, others are let off. So that's what this headline is, where they're basically saying we're not going to indict the Tribune or their employees. And the big reason they did this is because the president at the time, FDR, really hated the Chicago Tribune and Robert McCormick specifically. This is right around where you have another big change at the Chicago Tribune. Robert's biggest ally, his cousin Joe Patterson, who was running the New York Daily News, unfortunately passes away. This leaves a big vacancy at the paper, which Robert ends up having to fill. So at this point, he's running both of these major newspapers. So the reason this is such a blow is because these two individuals, even though they had different political points at different points in their life, they signed something called the Ironbound contract. They basically said, we're going to back each other up against anyone else, including our own family. And they really did that. They stayed together throughout their entire lives and ran one of the biggest media companies in the United States together. And now it was just Robert running his paper along with his cousin Sissy. Now, this is 1948. the Chicago Tribune ventures into a new media. So this is an article that they put out. They're letting people know that they created a television station, and they spent $500,000 to build it. And if people want to go watch any of their shows, this is a listing of all the shows you can see on Channel 9. I'm assuming everybody here has watched Channel 9 at one point or another. I know I have. So this is the first time WGN TV is available to the audiences. It's also where the last remaining cousin of Robert McCormick passes away. Eleanor Sissy Patterson passes away, and at this point, she had been running the Washington Times-Herald. Now Robert had to step in and take care of that newspaper as well. So he decides to step in, he takes over the newspaper. He does sell it shortly afterwards, but he's the last remaining Joseph Medill grandchild. So he's really the last remaining individual from this Tribune dynasty. I knew people were going to ask about it, so I put it in just real quickly. Most people have heard of Dewey Defeats Truman. Don't look for it on newspapers.com. They don't have it. They have a different newspaper because this is the early printing. This is when they were like, ooh, that's an oopsie. And they stopped printing it, and they started printing something else, basically saying the race is a lot closer than we thought. But those early newspapers were published and put out. And of course, the famous photograph comes from it because Truman, who also did not like the Tribune or Robert, he actually called the family a whole bunch of sewer rats in a letter we found. Wanted to make sure he specifically called out the Tribune for making this big blunder. So it's probably one of the most embarrassing moments in Tribune history. And the reason people remember it so much is because, well, Truman made fun of them. Several other newspapers made this mistake, but the Tribune's the one everybody remembers. U-505 is the last, in my opinion, major thing that the Tribune was involved in during the McCormick era. The Tribune involved in many ways in preserving the U-505 from destruction. Did a lot of work to bring the U-505 to Chicago, and then did a lot to have it restored and put on display at the Museum of Science and Industry. And if you want to see a little evidence of that, you can see this is not a Chicago Tribune, but it's a Tribune-run paper because the Chicago Tribune had this major paper mill operation in Canada. They had over 5 million acres of timberland, and they created several towns. One of those towns is called Baie-Comeau, and when they started bringing the U-505 from Portsmouth all the way to Chicago, it had to make some pit stops. But Robert McCormick, because of all of his efforts, he said, hey, you should stop at Baie-Comeau, and you should stay there for a couple of days. So you can see the photograph of a tug bringing the U-505 into Baie-Comeau, all so that Robert's paper mill employees and their families can get a first peek at the U-505. So this is all these photographs from when it was at Baie-Comeau. Now you can see a little evidence of it if you go visit the U-505 today, because in the McCormick exhibit hall, which is where it's on display, inside underneath the MSI, there is a small exhibit case in the very back of the room. And you can actually see the Baie-Comeau sign, and underneath it you see that big key. Most people call it key to the city. Baie-Comeau is a small town. It's a key to the town of Baie-Comeau that was given to the tug captain. So this is actually all part of MSI's collection today. So this is the last big thing Robert did before he passes. And again, the last thing a newspaper publisher does is pass away. So Robert McCormick passes April 1st, 1955. This is the last major headline that he was involved in. And when Robert was, he knew he was passing away. He was very sick the last couple of years of his life. And he made the decision, since he had no children, all of his cousins were gone, what was he going to do with his fortune? He was basically the one running the Tribune. He made the decision to create a trust at the time called the Robert R. McCormick Tribune Trust Foundation. And then he gave that his stock. That is what eventually, in his will, created Cantini Park, where you're visiting today. It's also where the current McCormick Foundation has its endowment from, is what Robert chose to do right on his passing. So this is McCormick, his last major headline. I really hope you enjoyed my little walk through the decades of the Chicago Tribune. Again, there's a lot more history I didn't cover because I had 45 minutes. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer either them live or if we have any remotely. So at this point, thank you very much.